Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place where curiosity can slow down, and difficult ideas are allowed to soften before they are understood. Tonight, we're going to explore something that usually arrives wrapped in flashing lights, dramatic music, and impossible promises: time travel. But instead of asking whether it looks cool or whether it makes for a good movie plot, we'll ask a much calmer question. What would it actually take to build one? Not in a garage, not with sparks and spinning wheels, but in the real universe we inhabit. A universe with rules, limits, and a very strong dislike for shortcuts. We won't rush. We won't chase paradoxes just yet. We'll begin where all real engineering begins, with constraints, energy, structure, balance, fragility. Along the way, we'll translate dense physics into images you can hold gently in your mind, like watching ripples move across a still lake at night. If you find these slow explorations comforting, you're welcome to like and subscribe, and if you feel inclined, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a quiet joy to see how many different nights meet here at once. Now, dim the room if you'd like, let your breathing settle, and let's begin our journey not with a machine, but with a misunderstanding that has followed time travel stories from the very beginning. A time machine, despite its name, is not really a machine in the way we usually understand machines. It isn't an engine that pushes forward, or a vehicle that carries you from one place to another. There are no gears that move you into the past, no fuel that propels you toward the future like wind in a sail. That image is comforting, familiar, and deeply misleading. To understand why, imagine a river, not a violent one, but a wide, slow river, moving steadily from the mountains toward the sea. If you place a boat in that river, the boat moves because the water moves. You can row a little faster or slower, but the direction of the river itself remains unchanged. Time, in our everyday experience, feels exactly like that river, always flowing forward, always carrying us along. Most fictional time machines assume you can simply turn the boat around, that if you build a strong enough engine, you can push upstream. But real physics tells a very different story. Time is not the water. Time is the shape of the riverbed itself. And changing where the river flows does not mean rowing harder, it means reshaping the land beneath it. In modern physics, time and space are not separate things. They are woven together into a single structure often called space-time. This structure is not rigid. It can stretch, curve and warp in response to energy and mass, much like a fabric pulled tight in some places and sagging in others. Planets bend it gently, stars bend it deeply, black holes fold it into extremes we still struggle to describe. So if a time machine were to exist, it would not be a device that travels through space-time, it would be a device that rearranges space-time itself. The traveller would not move forward or backward in time the way a car moves down a road. Instead, the road would bend, loop, or twist around them. Yeah, time would flow differently in their immediate surroundings, while the rest of the universe continues on its quiet way. This distinction matters more than it first appears. Machines, as we build them, are designed to operate within space-time. They obey its geometry. They assume its stability. A bridge does not worry about the ground deciding to curve into a spiral halfway across. A clock does not expect the seconds beneath its hands to stretch unevenly. Engineering works because the stage stays still. A time machine demands the opposite. It demands that the stage itself become the thing we manipulate, and that places us immediately in unfamiliar territory. Because space-time is not something we've ever built with. It has no beams to weld, no surfaces to polish, no edges you can touch. It responds only to energy. And it responds in ways that are precise, unforgiving, and often counterintuitive. To bend space-time even slightly requires enormous amounts of energy. Not the kind stored in batteries or released in chemical reactions, but the kind associated with massive objects and intense gravitational fields. When we talk about curving time, we're talking about working at scales usually reserved for stars and collapsed remnants of stars. This is why the very first problem of time travel is not navigation or paradox or even safety. It is power. And not just power in the sense of quantity, but power in the sense of control. Because pouring energy into space-time is like pressing down on a soft mattress. Press too lightly and nothing noticeable happens. Press too hard and you tear the fabric entirely. There is a narrow range where something interesting occurs, and that range is extraordinarily difficult to hold steady. This is where the cinematic image of a time machine truly falls apart. There is no sturdy metal shell protecting the traveller from the forces involved, because those forces define what the shell would even mean. There is no clear boundary between the machine and the universe around it. Any attempt to isolate the effect risks spreading it outward, influencing regions far beyond the intended destination. In this sense, a time machine is less like a vehicle and more like a weather system. It is not a thing you sit inside. It is a condition you create. And conditions, unlike machines, are notoriously difficult to keep contained. A storm does not respect fences, a shifting current does not stop at borders, and space-time, once disturbed, does not easily return to its original calm. Understanding this reframing is essential, because every challenge that follows grows naturally from it. Energy requirements become extreme because space-time resists change. Precision becomes critical because small distortions echo outward. Stability becomes fragile because the structure being manipulated is the very framework that allows cause and effect to make sense at all. So before we imagine where a time machine might take us, it helps to pause here, at the threshold of the problem itself. Not a machine waiting to be switched on, but a universe that must be persuaded gently and continuously to behave in a way it has never been observed to do. As we let that idea settle, the next question emerges naturally, almost quietly. If bending time means reshaping space-time, just how much energy would that truly require? And what happens when the power needed rivals the output of stars themselves? If space-time is the stage on which reality unfolds, then energy is the only hand that can rearrange that stage. Nothing else works. Not clever mechanics, not advanced materials, not elegant equations written on whiteboards. In the universe we inhabit, space-time listens only to energy and mass, and it responds with strict honesty. To get a sense of how demanding this conversation becomes, it helps to step away from everyday intuition. When we think about energy, we usually picture manageable things: a battery powering a phone, fuel pushing a car forward, electricity lighting a room. These are human-scale energies, comfortable and familiar, shaped by a world that barely bends space-time at all. But space-time curvature is not interested in convenience. It responds to the deepest wells of energy the universe has to offer. Planets create gentle dimples, stars create deep valleys, and only the most extreme objects like collapsed stellar cores twist space-time so dramatically that time itself begins to slow and distort in noticeable ways. This is why the idea of powering a time machine quickly escapes the realm of engineering projects and wanders into the territory of astrophysics. To change the flow of time in a localized region, you would need energy densities comparable to those found near stars or beyond. Not bursts of energy, but sustained, controlled concentrations. Not flashes, but steady pressure applied to the fabric of reality itself. One way to picture this is to imagine trying to bend a thick steel beam. A small amount of force does nothing at all. Push harder, and still nothing happens. Only when the force becomes enormous does the beam begin to flex. and when it does, it resists every step of the way. Space-time behaves much the same. It is flexible, yes, but only under extraordinary strain. This is where comparisons often turn cosmic. Entire planets, stripped of motion and converted fully into energy, still fall short. Even the output of all human civilization combined, multiplied many times over, would barely register as a meaningful push. To reach the necessary scale, thinkers often imagine civilizations that capture the full output of a star, surrounding it with vast structures designed to collect and redirect its energy. Even then, the challenge is not solved. Gathering energy is only the beginning. Holding it steady is the greater problem. Energy dense enough to curve space-time strongly does not like to stay put. It gravitates, it pulls inward, it collapses. Left unchecked, it would simply form a black hole, ending the experiment by sealing everything behind an event horizon. So the problem sharpens, not just how much energy is required, but how it can be arranged in a way that bends space-time without destroying itself or everything nearby. This is not a matter of insulation or shielding. There is no safe container when gravity itself becomes the dominant force. The energy does not sit inside space-time like water in a glass. It becomes part of space-time's shape. This leads to an uncomfortable realization. Any serious attempt to manipulate time would blur the boundary between machine and environment. The Earth would no longer be a neutral platform beneath the experiment. Its own gravity would interfere. Its structure could respond. The planet itself might experience stresses it was never meant to bear. What begins as a device becomes a planetary-scale disturbance. And yet, even this does not capture the full difficulty. Because energy, in physics, is never perfectly obedient. It fluctuates, it ripples, it leaks. At ordinary scales, we manage these imperfections with tolerances and margins. A bridge can sway slightly. A power grid can handle small losses. But in space-time engineering, there is no room for casual inefficiency. Every stray fraction of energy alters curvature. Every imbalance changes direction. Instead of a clean, stable distortion, you get turbulence in the geometry itself. Time begins to stretch unevenly. Paths that were meant to be smooth begin to wobble. And because space-time defines cause and effect, these wobbles do not stay local. They propagate outward, quietly rewriting conditions far beyond the intended region. This is why the energy problem is not merely about scale, but about precision. Imagine trying to hold a pencil upright on its tip while standing on a moving ship during a storm, while the floor itself reshapes beneath your feet. That is the level of balance required. The energy must be immense, perfectly distributed, and continuously adjusted, all without triggering collapse or runaway distortion. There is a subtle emotional shift that happens when this becomes clear. Time travel stops feeling bold and adventurous, and starts feeling fragile. The grand machine shrinks into a precarious configuration that exists only so long as everything remains perfectly aligned. One slip, one fluctuation too large, and the universe resolves the imbalance in the only way it knows how, by removing the configuration entirely. In many ways, this is comforting. It suggests that reality is not easily bullied, that even with immense power, there are limits enforced not by rules written down, but by the deep behavior of space-time itself. Energy can bend time, yes, but only under conditions so extreme and delicate that sustaining them becomes an achievement in its own right. As this understanding settles in, a quieter question begins to form. If ordinary energy already strains the universe to its breaking point, what kind of energy would be required to hold open more exotic distortions? Like tunnels through time or loops that lead back upon themselves? And what happens when the fuel needed does not behave like anything we've ever learned to control? That question draws us towards stranger territory, where the universe hints at materials and energies that feel almost fictional, yet emerge naturally from its deepest theories. If generating the energy required to bend space-time already feels overwhelming, containing that energy introduces a far subtler and more unsettling problem. Because in ordinary engineering, storage is where things calm down. A battery holds charge, a tank holds fuel, a dam holds water. We rely on containers to separate power from consequence. But space-time does not offer us that courtesy. At the scales required for time manipulation, energy cannot be placed inside something without becoming something else entirely. Energy this dense does not behave like a substance waiting patiently behind walls. It behaves like gravity. It pulls, it curves, it insists on reshaping its surroundings simply by existing. Trying to store it is less like locking fuel in a vault, and more like asking the vault to survive becoming a mountain. One way to imagine this is to picture trying to store a thunderstorm. Not the rain, not the lightning, but the pressure difference that creates the storm in the first place. You could gather clouds, perhaps, or capture rainwater, but the storm itself is not an object. It is a condition, and conditions do not stay confined when the environment allows them to spread. Space-time reacts in much the same way. The moment you concentrate enough energy to matter, you create curvature. That curvature changes how nearby energy behaves, pulling more inward, amplifying the distortion. Left unchecked, this feedback loop does not politely stabilize, it collapses. The universe has a very efficient solution for excessive energy density, and that solution is a black hole. This is not a dramatic exaggeration. From a physical standpoint, a black hole is not an exotic monster, but a bookkeeping outcome. When too much energy occupies too small a region, space-time folds inward until nothing can escape. No container can prevent this, because the container itself exists within the space-time being distorted. Its walls contribute mass. Its structure adds gravity. In trying to hold the energy, it becomes part of the collapse. This creates an uncomfortable inversion of ordinary design principles. In most systems, stronger containment increases safety. Thicker walls, heavier shielding, more robust supports. In space-time engineering, adding structure often makes things worse. Every additional component adds mass, and mass is inseparable from gravitational influence. The more you try to stabilize the system physically, the more you destabilize it gravitationally. The result is a kind of engineering paradox. To store enough energy to bend time, you must avoid adding anything that significantly bends space-time unintentionally. But removing structure removes control. You're left trying to balance immense forces with almost nothing to push against. Like holding a roaring fire in mid-air using only your hands and concentration. Even if, somehow, a configuration could be found that temporarily holds such energy without immediate collapse, it would not be still. Energy fluctuates at all scales. Tiny variations ripple through space-time like vibrations through a drumhead. At human scales, these ripples are negligible. At cosmic scales, they can be catastrophic. A slight unevenness in distribution could tilt the entire geometry, redirecting curvature where it was never intended to go. This is where the problem quietly extends beyond the machine itself. Because space-time does not recognize ownership. A distortion does not belong to the device that created it. It belongs to the universe. Nearby matter responds. Distant regions adjust. The Earth, the Moon, even the Sun would subtly participate in the rearrangement. What was meant to be local becomes entangled with everything else. This interconnectedness means that containment failure does not announce itself with sparks or alarms. It unfolds gently. A gradual increase in curvature, a slow drift in geometry, time stretching unevenly in places where it was meant to remain calm. By the time the problem is noticeable, the system may already be past the point where intervention is possible. There is also the question of duration. Holding a space-time distortion is not a momentary act. It requires continuous maintenance. Energy must be fed, adjusted, redistributed. Any interruption, even a brief one, risks collapse or uncontrolled release. Unlike shutting down a machine, you cannot simply turn off a time-bending configuration and expect space-time to relax neatly back into place. The relaxation itself can be violent. This introduces a deeply human vulnerability. Yet if power grids fail, components degrade, control systems drift. In ordinary contexts, these failures are inconvenient. In space-time engineering, they are existential. A temporary loss of control does not just damage equipment. It can rewrite the geometry of cause and effect in unpredictable ways. And yet, the most unsettling aspect of containment is not its fragility, but its indifference. Space-time does not care about intention. It does not reward caution. It does not pause to allow corrections. It responds to energy according to its nature, not our plans. In this sense, a time machine would not be a tool we wield, but a condition we negotiate with moment by moment. As this reality settles in, the earlier image of a sleek device grows increasingly distant, or what remains is something closer to a balancing act performed at the edge of cosmic forces, a configuration that exists only so long as everything remains perfectly aligned, perfectly fed, and perfectly undisturbed. And this brings us gently to the next difficulty. Even if energy could be generated, even if it could be contained without immediate destruction, there remains a quieter problem that undermines everything: efficiency. Because in space-time engineering, waste is not merely waste, it is misdirection. And misdirection, at these scales, means missing time itself. By this point, the difficulty of building a time machine has already grown far beyond gears and circuits. Energy must be immense, containment must be delicate. And now we arrive at a requirement that sounds, at first, almost fictional. Not just more energy, but a different kind of energy altogether. Something ordinary matter cannot provide. To see why, it helps to return to the image of space-time as a flexible fabric. If you place a heavy object on that fabric, it sinks inward. This is how gravity works in modern physics. Mass and energy tell space-time how to curve, and curved space-time tells matter how to move. The problem is that gravity, as produced by ordinary matter, always curves space-time in the same general direction. It pulls inward, it narrows paths, it encourages collapse. This inward pull is excellent for forming stars, planets, and galaxies. It is terrible for holding open structures like tunnels or bubbles in space-time. If you imagine trying to keep a tunnel open in soft ground, piling more dirt on top will only make it collapse faster. That is exactly what ordinary matter does to any attempt at a stable time distortion. To counteract this tendency, physics points towards something deeply unfamiliar, a form of energy that does not pull inward, but pushes outward. Not like pressure from air or water, but a kind of gravitational repulsion. This is what scientists refer to cautiously and precisely as negative energy. The name can be misleading. Negative energy does not mean anti-energy, nor does it imply something mystical or supernatural. It simply describes energy that behaves opposite to what we usually expect. Instead of deepening space-time wells, it props them open. Instead of encouraging collapse, it resists it. In the river analogy, it acts like invisible supports holding the banks apart, preventing them from caving in. Hints of this strange behavior appear in the quantum world. Even empty space, when examined closely, is not truly empty. It seethes with tiny fluctuations, brief appearances and disappearances of energy that never fully settle, under certain carefully arranged conditions, these fluctuations can be nudged into producing regions where the energy balance dips below what we would normally call zero. This does not violate the universe's rules, but it does test their boundaries. These negative energy regions are fleeting, fragile, and extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. They do not sit still. They do not scale easily. And most importantly, they do not like being gathered. For a time machine, negative energy would not be a curiosity. It would be essential. Without it, any attempt to create a stable space-time tunnel or loop would collapse almost immediately. With it, at least in theory, space-time could be coaxed into holding shapes it would otherwise reject. But theory and engineering are very different terrains. Producing tiny amounts of negative energy in laboratory conditions already stretches the limits of modern technology. Scaling that effect up to something macroscopic introduces problems that compound rapidly. The moment you try to concentrate negative energy, it interacts with surrounding space in unpredictable ways. Instead of forming a neat, supportive structure, it tends to disperse or destabilize. There's also a deeper constraint at work. The universe appears to tolerate negative energy only in tightly controlled doses. For every region where energy dips below the usual baseline, there must be compensation elsewhere. Think of it like borrowing against a strict cosmic ledger. You can take a small loan for a very short time, but the universe insists on repayment, often with interest. This balance makes sustained negative energy configurations extraordinarily difficult to maintain. Any attempt to hold them open long enough for practical use risks triggering compensatory effects that overwhelm the system. The very fuel meant to stabilize spacetime becomes another source of instability. This is where the language of engineering begins to soften into the language of negotiation. You're not commanding spacetime to behave differently. You're persuading it, briefly, under carefully chosen conditions to allow a shape it does not naturally favour. And persuasion, unlike force, requires constant attention. There is a quiet elegance to this realization. Time travel does not fail because we lack imagination. It fails because the universe is consistent. Ordinary matter collapses what we want to keep open. Exotic matter might hold it open, but only reluctantly, temporarily and at great cost. This also explains why negative energy, even if discovered in more accessible forms, would not instantly unlock time travel. Containment becomes even harder. Control becomes even finer, and the margin for error shrinks further still. The more exotic the ingredient, the more sensitive the recipe becomes. At this stage, the time machine resembles less a device and more a balancing act performed at the edge of possibility. Ordinary matter pulls too much. Exotic matter resists just enough, but only when conditions are perfect. And perfection, in a dynamic universe, is never stable for long. As these ideas settle, another subtle problem emerges. Even if exotic matter could be produced, even if negative energy could be sustained, and even if space-time could be shaped without immediate collapse, there remains the question of control. How do you keep such a configuration steady? How do you prevent tiny losses, leaks, or fluctuations from steering the entire structure off course? That question brings us gently toward the next challenge. Not one of raw power or strange materials, but of efficiency so extreme that even the smallest waste becomes a fatal flaw. At first glance, containment sounds like a secondary problem. Once you have the right energy, once you have discovered the exotic ingredients capable of shaping space-time, surely the rest is just careful engineering. Stronger fields, smarter controls, better monitoring. This assumption is natural, and it is also where many serious time travel proposals quietly fail. Because containment, at the scales required to influence time, is not a matter of building stronger walls. It is a matter of convincing space-time itself to hold still while you bend it, and space-time has never shown much interest in doing that. In ordinary systems, containment relies on separation. Fuel is kept apart from air. Electricity is routed through insulated paths. Pressure is held back by barriers. These strategies work because the forces involved do not redefine the space in which the container exists. But once you reach energies capable of distorting space-time, separation disappears as a concept. Then the container and the contents become part of the same geometric story. Imagine trying to build a bowl out of fog and then asking that bowl to hold a storm. The fog has no rigidity of its own. It shifts and reshapes under the slightest influence. Any attempt to reinforce it only adds more fog, which shifts as well. This is roughly what happens when engineers attempt to imagine containers for space-time bending energy. Every structure you add becomes part of the distortion you're trying to control. Exotic energy, especially the kind that resists gravitational collapse, complicates this further. It does not settle into predictable shapes. It interacts with surrounding fields in ways that are exquisitely sensitive to initial conditions. A tiny imbalance in distribution can amplify itself, redirecting forces inward or outward without warning. What begins as a supportive configuration can turn hostile simply because the balance drifts. This is where feedback becomes the silent enemy. In many machines, feedback can be dampened. Vibrations are absorbed. Oscillations are corrected. But in space-time engineering, feedback often strengthens itself. A slight curvature change alters how energy flows, which alters curvature again, which alters energy flow once more. The loop tightens. Corrections arrive too late. The unsettling part is how calm this process appears from the outside. There is no explosion at first, no dramatic failure. Instead, time itself begins to behave oddly near the configuration. Clocks drift. Signals arrive out of sequence. Events that should be simultaneous lose their alignment. These are not alarms. They are symptoms, and by the time they become obvious, the system may already be transitioning into a new, irreversible state. One of the universe's preferred ways of resolving excessive curvature is collapse. When energy density passes a certain threshold, space-time stops negotiating and starts sealing itself off. This is not punishment. It is simply geometry seeking stability. The result is a region from which information cannot escape, a boundary that quietly ends the experiment by making further interaction impossible. What makes this especially challenging is that collapse does not require excess energy alone. It can be triggered by asymmetry, uneven containment, a momentary loss of control. Even an attempt to extract energy from the system can destabilize the geometry. Yet much like removing a support beam from a delicately balanced structure, duration adds another layer of difficulty. Containment must be continuous. It cannot blink. Power must be supplied smoothly. Adjustments must be made constantly. There is no safe pause button. Unlike conventional machines, which can be powered down, space-time distortions resist gentle shutdown. Relaxing the configuration can release stored curvature in unpredictable ways, sending ripples outward that affect regions far beyond the original site. This means that a time machine would not merely require extraordinary technology, it would require extraordinary reliability, systems that never drift, controls that never lag, redundancies that do not themselves add destabilizing mass or energy. In human engineering, perfection is an aspiration. In space-time engineering, it is a prerequisite. There is also the problem of scale. The larger the region you try to contain, the more complex the geometry becomes. Small distortions are unstable. Large distortions are harder to manage. Somewhere between these extremes lies a narrow window where containment might be possible, but that window is not fixed. It shifts with environmental conditions, cosmic background influences, and even distant gravitational events. A passing wave from a far-off cosmic disturbance could, in principle, nudge the system out of balance. This reveals a sobering truth. A time machine would not exist in isolation. It would be coupled to the universe in ways that cannot be fully shielded. Every star, every planet, every movement of mass contributes, however faintly, to the overall space-time landscape. Containment becomes a global problem disguised as a local one, and so the nightmare is not that containment is difficult, but that it is never finished. It must be maintained moment by moment against a universe that is dynamic, noisy, and indifferent. The machine does not fail because it is attacked. It fails because reality continues to move. There is a quiet humility hidden here. Our most ambitious ideas often assume the universe will hold still while we work. But time travel, more than any other concept, exposes how little patience the cosmos has for interruption. You're not building a box. You're sustaining a delicate agreement with space-time itself. As this understanding settles, it naturally sharpens the next concern. Even if containment could be achieved, even if exotic energy could be held steady without collapse, there remains a more subtle adversary: waste, loss, inefficiency. Because when you're shaping space-time, even the smallest leak does not simply disappear, it changes where and when you arrive. By now, it may feel as though time travel has already failed several times over. The energy demands are immense, containment is fragile, exotic ingredients resist control. And yet, even if all of these problems were somehow managed, even if a delicate space-time configuration could be created and held steady, there remains a quieter problem that undermines everything else: efficiency. In everyday engineering, inefficiency is expected. Heat escapes, friction slows things down, signals lose clarity as they travel. These losses are inconvenient but tolerable. We compensate with extra power, backup systems, and safety margins. A car engine does not need to be perfect to get you home. A power plant does not need to be flawless to keep the lights on. Space-time engineering does not allow this generosity. When you're shaping time itself, inefficiency is not just wasted energy, it is misdirection. And misdirection at these scales means arriving somewhere else entirely. To understand why, imagine trying to throw a dart at a target the size of a grain of sand from across a continent. Now imagine that the wind shifts constantly, the ground beneath you moves, and the target itself is drifting through space. In such a situation, even the smallest error in aim does not result in a near miss. It results in a complete failure. Time travel magnifies error in exactly this way. The space-time distortions required to alter temporal flow must be shaped with extraordinary precision. Energy must be distributed evenly. Fields must remain symmetric. Any loss, any unevenness changes the geometry, and geometry in this context is destiny. We already see faint hints of this problem in technologies we rely on today. Systems that depend on precise timing must account for subtle effects that intuition alone cannot predict. Even tiny discrepancies, accumulating quietly, can lead to large positional errors. Engineers correct for this constantly, not because the effects are dramatic, but because they are persistent. Now scale that sensitivity up to a machine that aims not to locate you on the surface of a planet, but to place you at a specific moment in the universe's history. The tolerance window shrinks beyond anything human experience prepares us for. Losses that would be invisible in ordinary systems become catastrophic here. Efficiency, in this context, means near-perfect energy transfer. It means no stray curvature, no unintended ripples, no drift in alignment. The system must not only generate the right amount of energy, but deliver it in exactly the right pattern, at exactly the right time, and maintain that pattern continuously. This creates a paradox. The more complex the system becomes, the more opportunities there are for loss. Control mechanisms introduce delay. Monitoring introduces interference. Redundancy adds mass and energy of its own, subtly altering the very space-time the system is trying to stabilize. Efforts to improve reliability often worsen precision. There is also the problem of dissipation. Energy does not like to remain neatly organized. It spreads, it radiates, it leaks into surrounding space. In most machines, this is harmless. In a time machine, leaked energy does not simply vanish. It curves space-time elsewhere. It changes gradients. It nudges the entire configuration away from its intended form. Picture trying to hold a perfectly shaped soap bubble in a room filled with shifting air currents. Every small disturbance changes the bubble's surface. Now imagine that the bubble's shape determines where and when you emerge. That is the level of sensitivity involved. The system must remain exquisitely balanced, not just initially, but throughout its operation. This is why the idea of fixing errors on the fly becomes deeply problematic. Corrections themselves require energy. They alter the system, and because cause and effect are embedded in space-time, a delayed correction may arrive too late to influence the configuration it was meant to stabilize. You are always adjusting a moving target, with tools that change the target as they act. The efficiency paradox reveals something quietly profound. Time travel does not fail because we cannot build powerful machines. It fails because powerful machines are inherently messy. They generate heat, they vibrate, they drift. And the universe, when it comes to space-time geometry, has no tolerance for mess. This realization also reshapes how we think about control. In ordinary contexts, control means forcing a system to behave as desired. In space-time engineering, control means allowing the system to remain balanced without interference. The most successful configuration would be one that does almost nothing at all, yet maintains a precise distortion through perfect stillness. That kind of stillness is not something machines are good at achieving. It is closer to a natural equilibrium than an engineered one. And even natural equilibria are often temporary, vulnerable to disturbance from distant events. A fluctuation far away, a passing gravitational ripple from some remote cosmic occurrence, could, in principle, introduce just enough imbalance to disrupt the entire arrangement. There is something almost poetic in this fragility. Time travel, often imagined as an act of bold defiance, reveals itself as an exercise in restraint. The universe allows distortion only under conditions of extraordinary care. Every jewel must go exactly where it is meant to go. Every moment must remain synchronized. Every imperfection echoes. As this understanding settles, it becomes clear that efficiency is not a supporting concern. It is the central constraint. Even if energy could be generated, even if exotic matter could be contained, even if collapse could be avoided, a single inefficiency would quietly redirect the outcome, and this brings us to the next realization. Even if a perfect configuration could be achieved, even if efficiency were somehow maintained, there remains another challenge, one that feels almost mundane by comparison: navigation. Because time alone is not a destination, place matters just as much. At this point, it becomes clear that the problem of time travel is not missing hardware, but missing intuition. Every instinct shaped by centuries of building bridges, these ships and machines quietly works against us here. We reach for stronger materials, thicker walls, smarter mechanisms, and space-time responds with silence, because none of those ideas apply. Space-time is not something you construct inside, it is something you inhabit. And that single fact changes everything. In ordinary engineering, strength comes from resisting deformation. Steel beams push back against force. Concrete holds its shape under pressure. Materials succeed by refusing to bend. But space-time does not behave like a material at all. It is not rigid. It does not fracture. It curves. And more importantly, it curves willingly, responding smoothly to energy without ever cracking or snapping. This means that the tools of time travel would not be tools in the traditional sense. There would be no frame to reinforce, no hull to thicken, no surface to polish. The work would be entirely geometric. Instead of shaping objects, you would shape relationships. Instead of assembling parts, you would arrange energy so that space-time itself takes on a desired form. A useful image here is that of light passing through a curved lens. The glass does not push light into a new direction by force. It gently persuades the light to follow a different path by altering the geometry through which it travels. Space-time behaves similarly. When it curves, paths change naturally. Objects follow those paths not because they are pushed, but because that is simply how movement works in that geometry. This is why gravitational lensing, the bending of light around massive objects, is such an important clue. It shows that geometry alone can redirect motion. Nothing grabs the light. Nothing pulls it sideways. The curvature of space-time quietly reshapes the path, and the light complies without resistance. A time machine, if it were ever built, would rely on this same principle. It would not force time to flow differently. It would create geometry in which time already flows differently. The traveller would not struggle against the current. The current would simply take them elsewhere. This realization also explains why traditional materials are irrelevant. Steel cannot hold space-time in place any more than wood can stop a river from flowing downhill. The only way to influence the river is to reshape the landscape around it. In space-time engineering, energy is the landscape, geometry is the outcome. But shaping geometry is not like sculpting stone. Stone stays where you leave it. Geometry responds continuously. Every adjustment alters the entire structure. There is no fixed reference point, no external scaffolding. The act of shaping is inseparable from the result. This leads to an unsettling consequence. You cannot build a space-time structure in stages. You cannot construct half a tunnel and then pause to inspect it. The geometry only exists as a whole. Partial configurations are unstable. They collapse or dissolve before they can be examined. Engineering becomes an all-or-nothing act, performed in real time without rehearsal. There's also no such thing as a perfectly rigid geometric shape in space-time. Curvature bleeds outward. A region bent sharply here will influence regions far away, however slightly. This is why even small distortions require careful consideration of the entire surrounding universe. Geometry does not stop at boundaries. Imagine pressing your finger into a stretched sheet. The depression forms beneath your finger, but the tension changes everywhere. The edges feel it. The corners respond. Now imagine that sheet extends infinitely in all directions. That is the medium space-time engineering works with. This is where many proposed designs quietly unravel. They assume space-time can be treated like a material with edges, like clay on a table. But space-time has no table. There is no outside. Every curve must be balanced against every other curve. If the balance is off, the geometry will adjust itself, not according to design, but according to stability. There is a quiet humility in this realization. We're not mastering space-time. We're attempting to negotiate with it. The shapes we want are not forbidden, but they are disfavored. The universe will allow them only briefly under conditions that minimize disruption. This also changes how we think about control. In ordinary machines, control means command. You tell a system what to do, and it obeys. In geometric engineering, control means alignment. You arrange conditions so that the system naturally settles into the configuration you desire. If you push too hard, you lose control. If you interfere too often, you introduce instability. the most successful configuration would be one that feels almost effortless, a shape that space-time does not resist strongly, a gentle fold rather than a sharp kink. This may limit how dramatic time travel could ever be. Grand leaps across centuries might be far harder to sustain than subtle shifts, gentle enough that space-time tolerates them without protest. Seen this way, the time machine becomes less like a heroic invention and more like a fragile pattern drawn briefly on moving water. It exists only as long as conditions remain just right. It is not built to last. It is allowed to happen. And this brings us naturally to the next difficulty. If space-time must be shaped so delicately, how do you keep that shape confined? How do you prevent a carefully crafted geometry from spreading outward and influencing everything around it? That question leads us deeper into the problem of building a bubble in space-time, one that bends time locally without disturbing the entire universe. Once we accept that space-time must be shaped rather than built, a natural idea follows. If bending time affects everything, perhaps the solution is to bend only a little piece of it, not the whole universe, just a small, carefully controlled region, a bubble. This idea appears again and again in serious discussions of time travel, a localized pocket where space-time behaves differently from its surroundings. Inside the bubble, time might slow, loop, or shift. Outside, the universe would continue undisturbed. The image is soothing, a self-contained distortion, like a snow globe set gently on a shelf. But space-time does not recognize containers. There is no glass wall between one region and the next. Geometry flows continuously, and any attempt to create a sharp boundary introduces tension. The fabric resists abrupt changes. It smooths them out. It spreads them. To see why, imagine trying to create a perfectly still patch of water in the middle of a moving river. You might block the current briefly, but the pressure difference would immediately push water around the obstruction. Ripples would form, currents would reorganize, the stillness would not remain isolated. Space-time behaves in a similar way. If you distort it strongly in one region, the surrounding geometry responds. Paths curve nearby, time stretches slightly farther out. The effect weakens with distance, but it never truly stops. There is no switch that says, only here. This is not a flaw in the universe. It is a consequence of continuity. Space-time is a single, connected structure. You cannot fold one corner without tugging on the rest, and the sharper the fold, the stronger the tug. Engineers might imagine building a boundary using intense energy fields, something that holds the bubble in place. But fields themselves carry energy. They curve space-time too. The act of containment adds to the distortion, changing the shape you were trying to preserve. The bubble becomes self-referential, supported by forces that alter it simply by existing. This leads to a delicate balancing act. The boundary must be strong enough to hold the geometry in place, yet subtle enough not to overwhelm it. Too weak and the bubble leaks outward. Too strong and the containment becomes the dominant distortion. The system oscillates, never quite settling. There's also the problem of scale. Small bubbles are unstable because sharp curvature gradients form at their edges. Large bubbles require enormous energy to maintain. Somewhere between these extremes lies a narrow range where a bubble might persist briefly, but briefly is doing a great deal of work here, and sustaining such a region long enough for meaningful interaction becomes another challenge entirely. Even if a stable bubble could be formed, it would not be inert. Space-time inside and outside the bubble would still interact. Signals would cross the boundary. Energy would leak. Time differences would create shear at the interface, like layers of air moving at different speeds. This shear introduces turbulence into the geometry, further destabilizing the system. The universe does not like sharp transitions. It prefers gradients, smooth changes, gentle curves. A time bubble demands the opposite. It asks for a region where time behaves one way, and immediately outside it behaves another. Maintaining that contrast is like holding two different climates separated by an invisible wall. Nature will always try to mix them. This mixing is not violent at first, it happens quietly. A slight drift in synchronization, a gradual change in curvature. But because the geometry determines cause and effect, even subtle mixing can have profound consequences. Events inside the bubble may no longer align cleanly with events outside. Signals may arrive earlier or later than expected. Control becomes guesswork. There is also a deeper issue hiding beneath the geometry. Space-time is not just a stage. It carries information. It encodes the relationships between events. When you isolate a region and make time behave differently inside it, you risk severing those relationships. The bubble becomes causally strained, connected to the rest of the universe by threads that are stretched thin. This strain is not merely philosophical. It manifests physically as instability. The universe resists configurations that threaten to break its causal coherence. The more extreme the bubble's behavior, the stronger this resistance becomes. In some cases, the resistance may not be gradual at all. The configuration may simply fail to form. This is where many theoretical designs encounter an invisible wall. The equations allow a bubble. The geometry seems plausible. But when all interactions are accounted for, the configuration refuses to stabilize. It is not forbidden by a rule, but undermined by dynamics. Seen this way, the challenge of building a time bubble is not just about energy or materials, it's about harmony. The bubble must coexist with the rest of space-time without tearing the fabric that connects them. It must be different, but not too different. Isolated, but not disconnected. This requirement sharply limits what time travel could ever look like. Dramatic departures from ordinary time flow demand strong isolation, and strong isolation invites instability. Subtle distortions may be more acceptable, but they offer less dramatic results. The universe seems to permit only gentle deviations, and only for short durations. As this realization settles, another complication comes into focus. Even if a bubble could be created and held steady, even if its boundaries could be managed without collapse, there remains the problem of knowing where that bubble will end up. Because space-time is not static. Everything moves, and a bubble, once formed, moves with it. This brings us quietly to the next challenge. Not how to shape space-time, but how to aim it. How to ensure that a carefully crafted distortion arrives not just at the right moment, but at the right place in a universe that never stops shifting. As the challenge of shaping and containing space-time grows clearer, it becomes almost inevitable that black holes enter the conversation. Not as monsters, not as villains, but as examples. They are, after all, the universe's most successful space-time distorters. Wherever a black hole exists, time slows dramatically. Paths curve inward. Cause and effect stretch and compress in ways that border on the surreal. If space-time can be bent far enough to alter time, black holes prove that the universe knows how to do it. The temptation, then, is obvious. If nature can produce such extreme distortions, perhaps we can learn to borrow a little of that behavior. Not a full collapse, just enough gravity to shape time without sealing it away forever. This is where the idea of miniature black holes sometimes appears. Not the kind born from collapsing stars, but hypothetical, tightly controlled regions of extreme curvature, small enough to manage, short-lived, carefully balanced. In theory, such objects could provide the intense gravitational effects needed to slow, or redirect time within a confined region. But black holes are not tools, they are outcomes. They are what happens when control is lost. To understand why this matters, it helps to remember what defines a black hole. It is not simply a heavy object. It is a region where space-time has curved so sharply inward that escape becomes impossible. Once that threshold is crossed, the geometry closes in on itself. No signal, no force, no correction can travel outward fast enough to reverse the process. This makes black holes uniquely unforgiving. In ordinary engineering, mistakes can often be corrected. You shut down a system, you vent pressure, you remove energy. With a black hole, there is no graceful exit. The configuration does not fail explosively. It succeeds too well. It becomes stable in the one way you do not want. The idea of controlled collapse, then, is not about avoiding black holes entirely. It is about dancing at the edge of that threshold, applying enough curvature to achieve time distortion while stopping just short of the point of no return. This is a balancing act of extraordinary delicacy. Imagine trying to balance a marble on the peak of a smooth hill, not in a calm room but on a ship at sea. The slightest motion sends the marble rolling irreversibly downward. The moment it leaves the peak, you cannot simply place it back. Black hole formation is that roll. Once it begins, control is lost. There is also the issue of scale. Smaller black holes would evaporate quickly, shedding their energy back into space. Larger ones persist, but are far more destructive. The window where a black hole is both long-lived enough to be useful and small enough to manage is vanishingly narrow. And managing it requires precision that pushes beyond what any known control system can achieve. Even if such precision were possible, the presence of a near-collapse region introduces severe instability. Space-time near this threshold becomes hypersensitive. Tiny fluctuations in energy density can tip the balance. A slight asymmetry can trigger runaway collapse, and because cause and effect are embedded in space-time, any delay in response makes correction impossible. There is a quieter problem as well. Black holes do not merely curve space-time, they isolate it. They create boundaries beyond which information cannot pass. This makes them deeply incompatible with navigation. A system designed to place you at a specific time and location cannot rely on a mechanism that cuts off communication with the outside universe. Guidance, feedback, and correction all fail once that boundary forms. This is why black holes, despite their dramatic appeal, represent the ultimate warning sign in time travel engineering. They are what space-time does when pushed too far. They mark the limit where shaping becomes surrender, and yet they are instructive. They teach us that time distortion is not speculative. It is real. It occurs naturally under extreme conditions, but those conditions are hostile to control, hostile to stability, and hostile to human intention. The dream of a controlled black hole is, in many ways, a dream of perfect balance. Enough gravity to slow time, but not enough to trap it. Enough curvature to bend paths, but not enough to sever them. The universe has shown no sign that such a balance can be held for long. This brings a subtle shift in perspective. The obstacle is no longer technology alone, it is timing. Control must be continuous. Corrections must be immediate. And yet, the closer you get to the necessary conditions, the faster everything happens. Time itself becomes distorted, compressing response windows to nothing. The machine would need to react faster than causality allows. In this sense, miniature black holes reveal a deeper truth. Time travel does not fail because we lack power. It fails because power creates regimes where control evaporates. The very forces needed to bend time erase the ability to steer it. As this realization settles, the narrative begins to pivot. If even nature's most extreme space-time tools are unsuitable for navigation, then the problem may not be how to create stronger distortions, but how to aim weaker ones with extraordinary accuracy. Because bending time without knowing where you are going is no better than not bending it at all. And so, quietly, the focus shifts away from collapse, away from extremes, toward motion, toward reference frames, toward the simple but unsettling fact that the universe itself is always moving, carrying every destination along with it. It's easy to imagine time as a calendar page you can flip, forward, backward, today to yesterday, yesterday to last year. This image feels comfortable because it mirrors how memory works. We remember events as dates, as moments detached from the world that held them. But the universe does not store time that way. In reality, there is no such thing as a moment without a place. Every event is anchored to a location, and that location is never still. The Earth spins beneath our feet. It circles the sun. The sun drifts through the galaxy. The galaxy itself glides within a vast cosmic web. When you say now, you're already describing something in motion. This matters because a time machine does not pause the universe while it works. There is no freeze frame. The world keeps moving. Stars keep drifting. Space continues its quiet expansion. So arriving at the correct moment without accounting for where that moment is located is not arrival at all. It is absence. Imagine stepping onto an escalator while blindfolded. You know the direction it moves. You know roughly how fast. But without seeing where you place your foot, the timing means nothing. Step too early and you miss. Step too late and you fall behind. The escalator does not wait for you to synchronize. Time travel presents the same challenge, but magnified beyond intuition. You're not stepping onto a moving stair. You're attempting to synchronize with a moving universe. The destination you want is not fixed in space. It is carried along by countless overlapping motions, all of which must be accounted for at once. This is why the right time is not enough. A moment from the past is not stored somewhere, waiting patiently to be revisited. It existed at a particular location in space-time, a location that no longer coincides with where the Earth happens to be now. Miss that location, even slightly, and you do not arrive late, you arrive nowhere. The unsettling implication is simple. Time travel is not about choosing a year. It is about choosing an address written in both space and time simultaneously. A 4-part address, woven together, where separating one from the other makes the destination meaningless. In everyday life, we ignore this complexity because it rarely matters. Our movements are small compared to planetary scales. Our timing is forgiving. But space-time engineering offers no such comfort. The tolerances shrink until intuition breaks down entirely. Consider how many motions must be layered together just to describe where Earth is at this moment. Rotation, orbit, galactic drift, local gravitational influences. None of these motions are perfectly regular. They wobble. They respond to distant masses. They are influenced by forces we barely notice, but cannot ignore at precision scales. A time machine would need to account for all of this continuously. Not just once, but throughout the journey. Because while the machine operates, the destination continues to move. You're aiming at a target that refuses to stand still. This also means that navigation cannot be corrected casually. In ordinary travel, if you miss a turn, you adjust. If you arrive slightly off course, you walk the rest of the way. In time travel, there is no nearby sidewalk. There is no gradual correction. You either intersect the destination's space-time location, or you do not. The universe offers no guarantee of proximity. Space is vast, empty, unforgiving. A small spatial error at planetary scales becomes an ocean of vacuum at cosmic scales. There is no atmosphere waiting to catch you, no surface beneath your feet, just silence. This realization gently dismantles another familiar fantasy, the idea that time travel could be exploratory, that you could look around if you arrive slightly off target. In reality, there may be nothing to look around with. No reference points, no signals. Navigation is not a convenience layered on top of time travel. It is the foundation that makes arrival possible at all. And yet, navigation itself depends on timing. Signals take time to travel. Measurements lag behind reality. Any correction you make is already outdated by the time it's applied. This creates a subtle but profound difficulty. You're always steering using information from the past while aiming for a future that keeps moving. There is a quiet elegance in how unforgiving this is. The universe does not conspire against time travel. It simply continues being what it is. Dynamic, relational, always in motion. The difficulty arises not from malice but from consistency. This also reframes the role of precision. Precision is not about being clever. It is about humility, about acknowledging that the universe does not round errors in your favour. It does not forgive approximations. It does not pause to allow recalibration. As this understanding settles, the emotional tone of time travel shifts again. The problem is no longer dramatic collapse or exotic materials. It is quiet misalignment, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but simply results in absence. A destination missed so completely that there is no evidence it was ever aimed for at all. This is where the notion of space-time as a single address becomes essential. You're not choosing when to go, you're choosing where and when together inseparably. The two are fused. Pull them apart and the destination dissolves. And this raises a final, uneasy thought. If even defining the destination requires precision beyond ordinary intuition, what happens when the smallest timing errors begin to matter? What happens when differences too small to feel, too small to see, quietly decide whether arrival is possible at all? That question draws us deeper into the problem of precision, into a realm where the universe's tolerance for rounding errors drops to zero. There is a comforting belief woven into everyday life, that small errors do not matter very much. If you leave a minute late, you still arrive. If a clock runs slightly fast, you barely notice. Our world seems forgiving, padded with margins that allow us to function without constant precision. This belief works only because the systems we interact with are designed to tolerate it. The universe itself is far less generous. Long before time travel enters the conversation, we already rely on technologies that demand extraordinary timing accuracy. Systems that quietly correct for effects no human senses directly. Not because scientists enjoy complexity, but because without those corrections the systems simply do not work. Position drifts, signals misalign, navigation fails. What makes this unsettling is not how advanced these systems are, but how fragile they would be without constant attention. Errors so small they feel imaginary to us accumulate relentlessly. Left uncorrected, they grow until they overwhelm the system entirely. This is the first hint of how unforgiving precision becomes once you step outside human intuition. Our senses evolved for survival, not for measuring the universe's subtleties. We are excellent at noticing falling objects and approaching threats. We are terrible at detecting minute differences in timing, differences that nonetheless shape where and when things actually happen. In everyday life, this mismatch is harmless. In space-time engineering, it becomes decisive. Time travel magnifies timing errors in a way that feels almost cruel. A discrepancy too small to register in consciousness can determine whether a destination is reached or missed entirely. The problem is not that time travel requires precision. Many technologies do. The problem is that time travel requires precision at every moment, across every interacting system, without pause or drift. To picture this, Imagine trying to clap your hands exactly in sync with a distant echo, while the echo itself is changing speed and the air between you is constantly shifting. Now imagine that missing the clap by even the smallest fraction means the echo never arrives at all. There is no second chance, no gradual correction. This is the reality of temporal precision. You're not correcting after the fact. You're attempting to align with a moving target in real time, using signals that are always slightly delayed. By the time you know you are off, you're already too late. The universe does not provide a built-in buffer. There is no grace period where things almost work. Either the configuration aligns, or it does not form in the first place. Precision is not something you add at the end. It is the condition that allows the system to exist at all. This becomes especially troubling when you consider how many layers of timing must align simultaneously. Energy delivery, field stabilization, geometric shaping, environmental influences. Each layer introduces its own potential for drift. Each correction alters the system slightly. And all of this must remain synchronized while space-time itself is being reshaped. In human-scale systems, their complexity can often be managed with redundancy. If one component falters, another compensates. In space-time engineering, redundancy becomes dangerous. Additional systems add mass, energy, and delay. They introduce new interactions that must themselves be synchronized. Efforts to increase reliability can quietly undermine precision. There is also the problem of measurement. To correct an error, you must first detect it. But detection takes time. Signals must propagate. Data must be processed. In ordinary machines, this delay is negligible. In a time-bending system, delay becomes distortion. By the time information arrives, the geometry it describes may no longer exist. This creates a strange inversion of control. The more aggressively you monitor the system, the more you interfere with it. The more gently you monitor, yes, the less information you have. Somewhere between these extremes lies a narrow window where observation and stability coexist. Finding that window would be an achievement as great as generating the necessary energy in the first place. There is a quiet dread in realizing that the universe is not hostile here. It is simply exact. It does not adjust expectations to suit human limits. It does not soften consequences for small mistakes. Precision beyond intuition is not a challenge it poses deliberately. It is a consequence of how reality is structured. This is why time travel feels increasingly less like exploration and more like alignment. You're not boldly stepping into the unknown. You're attempting to fit yourself into a moving pattern that does not pause or widen to accommodate you. As this idea settles, something subtle shifts. The difficulty of time travel no longer feels dramatic. It feels quiet, administrative almost. A matter of bookkeeping so strict that even tiny discrepancies are unacceptable. The universe becomes an auditor with infinite patience and zero tolerance for rounding errors. And this leads naturally to the next realization. If errors too small to feel can decide whether a destination is reached, what happens when those errors compound? What happens when multiple tiny misalignments reinforce one another? Not loudly, but inexorably. That question carries us into the final layer of this problem, where small mistakes do not merely cause failure, but scatter outcomes across distances so vast that correction is no longer meaningful. There is a moment in many complex systems when error stops being a problem you can fix and becomes a path you're already on. In everyday life, we rarely notice when that moment passes. We miss a turn and take the next one. We arrive a little late and adjust our plans. The world seems built to absorb our imperfections. Space-time is not. When time travel enters the picture, small errors do not remain small for long. They do not announce themselves loudly. They do not trigger alarms. They simply redirect outcomes, quietly and decisively. until the destination you intended no longer exists in the direction you are heading. To understand why, it helps to think about alignment rather than accuracy. Accuracy suggests a fixed target. Alignment suggests a relationship that must be maintained continuously. Time travel depends on alignment across space and time at once. Miss that alignment even slightly, and the relationship dissolves. In ordinary navigation, distance provides mercy. If you're off by a few steps, you can see the destination and walk toward it. If you're off by a few degrees, you still travel in roughly the right direction. In space-time navigation, there is no roughly. There is only intersection or non-intersection. You either arrive at the correct space-time location, or you pass through a region where that location never was. This is where the scale of the universe becomes unforgiving. Space is vast beyond intuition. Between stars lies not emptiness in the comforting sense, but a near-perfect vacuum that offers no reference points, no landmarks, no resistance. A misplacement that seems trivial at human scales becomes infinite separation when nothing nearby exists to guide correction. And correction itself assumes you survive long enough to attempt it. A traveller emerging far from matter, far from structure, far from any meaningful frame of reference, may have no environment in which to act, no signals to receive, no way to orient. Navigation ends not with an explosion, but with silence. There is also the problem of timing after arrival. Even if you emerge close to where you intended, space-time does not freeze to let you adjust. Everything continues moving. Any attempt to correct your position requires time, and time introduces further drift. Each correction compounds the original misalignment rather than resolving it. This compounding effect is subtle but relentless. Small spatial errors interact with timing errors. Timing errors alter geometry. Geometry alters motion. What begins as a tiny deviation becomes a cascade, each step reinforcing the next, not dramatically, but persistently. It is tempting to imagine building safeguards against this. Backup navigation, emergency corrections, return paths. But these solutions assume reversibility. They assume that the path you took can be retraced. In space-time engineering, that assumption often fails. The configuration that allowed departure may no longer exist once disturbed. The geometry may have relaxed, shifted, or collapsed into a different state. This is why the idea of an undo becomes so fragile. To undo a space-time misalignment, you would need to recreate the exact conditions that allowed the original configuration to form. The same energy distribution, the same geometry, the same environmental influences. Any difference, however small, produces a different outcome. In this sense, time travel behaves less like travel and more like a singular event. It happens once, under a specific alignment, and then that alignment dissolves. Trying again is not repeating the same experiment. It is starting a new one, with a new set of unknowns. There is a quiet finality to this. It means that even successful time travel would be extraordinarily rare, not because the universe forbids it outright, but because the conditions that allow it are too narrow to be reproduced reliably. Success would not scale. It would not become routine. It would remain exceptional, fragile, and deeply dependent on chance. This realization shifts the emotional tone again. Time travel stops feeling like a door you could open repeatedly, and starts feeling like a momentary alignment of cosmic circumstances. Something that might occur once, briefly, and then never again in quite the same way. And this is not necessarily tragic. It is consistent with how the universe treats other extreme phenomena. Conditions that produce rare outcomes do so sparingly. They do not linger. They do not adapt themselves to human convenience. They appear and then they pass. There is also a deeper calm in accepting irreversibility. Much of human anxiety comes from the belief that mistakes can always be corrected if we act quickly enough. Space-time reminds us that some paths do not loop back, not out of cruelty but out of structure. When small errors become cosmic in scale, responsibility shifts. It is no longer about fixing what went wrong, but about acknowledging that the attempt itself carries consequences that cannot be revised. This is not a warning, it is an observation. As this settles in, the mind naturally drifts toward paradox. If outcomes scatter so easily, if misalignment leads to irreversible divergence, what happens when a path folds back on itself? What happens when cause and effect threaten to overlap, not by accident, but by design? That question does not arrive with urgency. It arrives softly, like a thought you notice just before sleep. And it carries us away from navigation and into the quieter, stranger territory where physics itself seems to hesitate. The grandfather paradox is usually introduced as a story. You travel to the past, you change something essential. The future you came from no longer exists. The contradiction feels sharp, almost theatrical, and it tends to pull attention toward morality and intention. But when viewed through the lens of engineering, the paradox softens into something less dramatic and more revealing. Instead of asking whether you should change the past, the universe asks whether the system can remain stable if you try. In complex systems, feedback is everything. Small actions can loop back into the system that produced them, sometimes reinforcing behavior, sometimes damping it. When feedback is well managed, systems remain calm. When feedback runs unchecked, instability follows. This is not philosophy. It is a practical concern in everything from electronics to climate models. Time travel introduces feedback of the most extreme kind. An effect influencing its own cause, information travelling in a loop rather than a line. From an engineering perspective, this is a red flag long before it becomes a moral dilemma. Systems that feed directly into themselves tend to oscillate, amplify noise, or collapse entirely. A useful analogy comes from sound. Place a microphone too close to a speaker, and the system begins to scream. Not because the sound is angry, but because it is feeding back into itself. Each cycle amplifies the signal until it overwhelms the system's ability to control it. The equipment has no opinion about whether the sound should exist. It simply cannot handle the loop. Time loops behave similarly. When events feed back into their own origins, the system must either dampen the loop or break it. Otherwise, small perturbations amplify. Tiny uncertainties grow. The timeline becomes hypersensitive to noise. Stability disappears. This reframing dissolves much of the emotional charge around paradox. The problem is not that the universe forbids contradiction out of principle. It is that contradiction creates configurations that cannot be held steady. They wobble, they diverge, they refuse to settle into a consistent pattern. From this perspective, the grandfather paradox is not a story about erasing oneself. It is a description of a feedback loop with no stable solution. The moment such a loop forms, the system reacts, not by punishing the traveller, but by failing to sustain the configuration that allowed the loop to exist. This also explains why many proposed resolutions to paradoxes feel unsatisfying. Splitting timelines, branching universes, self-consistent histories. These ideas may preserve logic, but they often do so by moving the instability elsewhere. The engineering problem remains. How does a system with feedback maintain coherence when every loop introduces amplification? In practical terms, any attempt to create a time loop would require extraordinary damping, mechanisms that absorb uncertainty, structures that prevent small fluctuations from cascading. But damping itself requires energy and intervention, which introduces delay and disturbance. The loop becomes harder to control the more you try to control it. There is a quiet irony here. The more carefully you attempt to manage paradox, the more you risk creating it. observation changes the system. Correction alters geometry. The effort to stabilize the loop feeds back into the loop itself. This leads to a subtle but powerful conclusion. Time travel does not need a rule that says do not change the past. It needs only the reality that systems with self-referential feedback are unstable. The universe does not moralize, it destabilizes. This destabilization may occur before any dramatic contradiction is realized. The time loop may fail to form at all. The configuration may dissolve during its creation. The geometry may refuse to align in a way that allows cause and effect to overlap. From the outside, it looks like prevention. From the inside, it feels like impossibility. Understanding paradox as instability also reframes the role of intention. Whether you mean to change history or not becomes secondary. The system does not wait to see what you plan to do. The mere possibility of feedback may be enough to trigger instability. The universe reacts to structure, not motivation. This perspective gently lowers the stakes. Time travel is not dangerous because of what humans might do. It is dangerous because of what feedback does to delicate systems. The paradox is not a narrative trap, it is an engineering warning label. As this idea settles, it invites a quieter kind of acceptance. The universe may not be protecting history for moral reasons, it may simply be protecting coherence. Self-consistency is not an ethical choice, it is a structural requirement, and this opens the door to an even subtler idea. If feedback loops are unstable, perhaps the universe has mechanisms that prevent them from forming in the first place. Not rules written into reality, but physical processes that quietly disrupt loops before they can settle. That possibility draws us toward a hypothesis that feels less like a prohibition and more like a natural immune response, a way space-time pushes back, gently and persistently, against configurations that threaten to tear its causal fabric. If time loops behave like unstable feedback systems, then it is natural to wonder whether the universe has ways of preventing them from forming at all. Not through commandments or cosmic warnings, but through ordinary physical behavior acting at extraordinary scales. This is where the idea often called chronology protection enters the conversation, not as a law etched into the universe, but as a pattern that seems to emerge whenever time threatens to fold back on itself. The phrase itself can sound dramatic, as if the universe is actively guarding the past. But a calmer interpretation reveals something more subtle. Instead of enforcing order, space-time may simply refuse to hold shapes that undermine its own coherence. Much like a material that cannot support a certain structure without cracking, the universe may respond to time loops by becoming unstable in their presence. To understand this, imagine trying to balance a pencil perfectly upright on a smooth table. In theory, the position exists. The laws of physics do not forbid it. But in practice, the slightest tremor causes the pencil to fall. The configuration is allowed, but it is not stable. Time loops may belong to this same category. Possible in principle, but impossible to maintain in reality. At the heart of this idea lies the restless nature of space-time itself. Even in the absence of matter, space-time is never perfectly still. Versatility. It ripples gently. Tiny fluctuations appear and vanish. These movements are not dramatic. They are the background hum of the universe, always present, always active. When space-time is gently curved, these fluctuations remain harmless. But when curvature becomes extreme, especially in configurations that attempt to loop time back on itself, those tiny fluctuations can grow. They feed on the very structure that makes the loop possible. The closer the system comes to forming a closed path through time, the more sensitive it becomes to disturbance. This sensitivity is not selective. It does not wait for intent. It does not care whether the loop would be used or merely observed. The geometry alone is enough. The moment space-time approaches a configuration where cause and effect overlap, instability increases sharply. The system begins to shake itself apart before the loop can settle. This is why chronology protection is best understood not as prevention, but as disruption. The universe does not say no. It simply never allows the configuration to finish forming. From the outside, it looks like an invisible barrier. From the inside, it feels like a system that cannot quite come into focus. There is something deeply soothing in this interpretation. It removes the need for cosmic enforcement. There are no guards at the gates of time. There's only structure responding to stress. When pushed too far, it reconfigures itself into something more stable, even if that means erasing the attempted loop entirely. This also explains why such protection would be universal. It would not depend on location, era, or technology. Any attempt to form a time loop anywhere in the universe would face the same problem, because the same physical principles apply everywhere. Stability does not vary with ambition. In this view, chronology protection is not hostile. It is conservative. It favours continuity over novelty. It preserves the simple forward flow of cause and effect not because that flow is sacred, but because it is stable. Systems that run one way are easier to maintain than systems that chase their own tails. This perspective also reframes the role of advanced technology. Even with perfect control, perfect energy, and perfect intention, the underlying instability may remain. The limitation would not be one of capability, but of compatibility. Time loops may simply be shapes space-time cannot hold, no matter how carefully we try to support them. There is a quiet parallel here with many other natural limits. Airplanes cannot hover indefinitely without propulsion. Mountains cannot grow beyond certain heights without collapsing under their own weight. These are not prohibitions, they're consequences. Chronology protection may belong to the same family of constraints. As this idea settles, the emotional tone of time travel shifts once more. The universe no longer feels adversarial. It feels cautious, like a system that prefers simplicity, not out of laziness, but out of resilience. Forward-moving time is robust, looping time is fragile, and fragile structures do not last long in a dynamic universe. This leads to a calm realization. Even if time travel were attempted, even if all engineering hurdles were overcome, the universe itself might gently undo the effort before it could succeed. Not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, by refusing to stay in the required shape. And this raises one final possibility. If space-time resists time loops naturally, then perhaps machines designed to create them would never fully engage. They might stall, they might refuse to lock into configuration, they might behave as if an invisible safety mechanism were always active. That idea draws us toward the next layer of this story. Not the universe enforcing rules, but machines encountering boundaries they cannot cross. Systems that appear to decide, not through choice, but through physics, that certain configurations are unreachable. At this point in the journey, something important has shifted. The obstacles to time travel no longer feel like dramatic barriers standing in the way of human ambition. They feel more like doors that were never built to open in the first place. Not locked, not guarded, simply absent. This is where the idea of temporal locks emerges. Not as devices added deliberately for safety, but as behaviours that appear naturally when systems approach configurations space-time cannot support. The machine does not decide to stop. It simply cannot finish becoming what it was designed to be. In everyday engineering, this kind of behaviour is familiar. Some systems refuse to settle into certain states no matter how carefully they're constructed. A bridge may sway uncontrollably at a particular wind speed. An engine may vibrate itself apart at a specific rotation rate. These outcomes are not malfunctions. They're expressions of incompatibility between structure and environment. A time machine approaching a forbidden configuration may behave in much the same way. As it nears the precise alignment required to form a loop through time, instabilities rise, energy fluctuates, geometry wavers, control systems struggle to converge. From the outside, it may look like a machine that endlessly approaches readiness but never quite arrives. This is not ethics encoded in hardware. It is physics expressing preference. Some configurations are stable, others are not. Systems naturally gravitate toward the former and slip away from the latter. No warning lights are necessary. The machine does not need to know why it cannot proceed. It simply fails to lock into place. And this idea challenges a deeply human assumption that if something is possible in principle, then with enough effort it must eventually be achievable. The universe does not share this assumption. Possibility and stability are not the same thing. A configuration may exist in theory while remaining unreachable in practice, not because it is forbidden, but because it cannot persist long enough to matter. Temporal locks would not appear dramatic. There would be no moment of refusal, no decisive failure. Instead, there would be endless near success, parameters aligning almost perfectly, systems oscillating around target states, corrections growing smaller but never vanishing. The machine forever approaching completion, yet never crossing the threshold. There is something strangely gentle about this failure mode. It does not punish curiosity. It does not destroy the machine, it simply withholds finality. The universe allows the attempt but not the outcome. This also explains why retries might be meaningless. If a configuration cannot stabilize once, repeating the attempt does not bring you closer. Each attempt explores the same unstable region of possibility, encountering the same resistance. The machine is not learning. The system is not adapting. The boundary remains. From the perspective of the builders, this could be deeply confusing. Every subsystem functions. Every test passes in isolation. Energy flows. Fields form. Geometry responds. And yet the final configuration never holds. It is as if the last step exists only on paper. This is where the phrase self-refusing machine becomes useful. Not because the machine possesses agency, but because refusal is the most natural way humans describe persistent non-completion. The machine does not fail catastrophically. It simply never arrives. Importantly, this behavior would not be limited to dangerous intentions. The machine would refuse equally whether the traveller planned to change history, observe quietly, or do nothing at all. Physics does not inspect motives, it responds to structure. This removes the need for moral safeguards at the deepest level. There is no need to encode rules that say do not repeat moments, or do not interfere. If the underlying configuration cannot form, those scenarios never arise. The universe handles enforcement automatically, through instability rather than prohibition. There is a calm elegance in this. It suggests that some of our greatest fears about time travel may be unnecessary. Not because humanity is wise enough to restrain itself, but because reality itself may be too rigid to accommodate such freedom. Seen this way, time travel becomes less a forbidden act and more an unreachable shape, like trying to tie a knot in a rigid rod. The idea makes sense conceptually, but the material simply does not bend that way. This realization carries a quiet emotional weight. It means that even perfect knowledge might not be enough. Even flawless engineering may encounter limits that do not announce themselves as limits. They appear only as endless incompletion. And perhaps that is the most humane boundary imaginable. Not a wall, but a horizon. Something you can approach indefinitely without ever colliding with it. Something that invites understanding without permitting possession. As this settles in, attention naturally turns inward. If the universe quietly refuses certain configurations, What does that say about the role of the traveller? Even if the machine could lock, even if space-time could be shaped, would the human body and mind remain intact through such a process? That question brings the story away from machines and back to ourselves, where the final challenges of time travel become personal rather than cosmic. Up to this point, the difficulties of time travel have belonged mostly to machines and mathematics: energy, precision, stability, geometry. These challenges feel distant, almost abstract. But the moment a human enters the picture, the problem becomes immediate and personal. Even if space-time could be shaped perfectly, even if navigation were flawless, there remains a fragile passenger at the centre of the journey. The human body is not designed for violent geometry. It evolved in a narrow band of conditions where gravity is gentle, acceleration is slow, and time flows smoothly enough that cells can divide, repair, and communicate without interruption. Space-time engineering threatens all of these assumptions at once. Consider acceleration. In everyday life, acceleration is something we feel directly. A sudden stop throws us forward. A sharp turn presses us sideways. Our bodies tolerate these forces only because they occur within familiar limits. Beyond those limits, organs shift, blood redistributes, and consciousness falters. Time travel would not involve gradual acceleration. It would require rapid changes in motion and geometry that far exceed anything the body has adapted to withstand. Even without dramatic speeds, the act of reshaping space-time itself creates forces that have no everyday equivalent. Cells experience their environment locally. They respond to pressure, tension, and chemical signals. When space-time curves sharply, those local environments distort. Forces that are uniform at human scales can become uneven at cellular scales. Structures that rely on precise alignment begin to strain. A useful image here is a snowflake inside a storm engine. A snowflake is delicate but stable in calm air. Place it inside powerful turbulence, and it does not fail heroically. It simply cannot retain its structure. The forces are not malicious, they are simply incompatible with fragility. Space-time distortion behaves similarly. It does not target the body, it does not attack. It merely creates conditions that biological systems were never meant to endure. Membranes stretch unevenly, chemical gradients shift, signals arrive out of sequence. What feels like a single moment at the human scale may become chaos at the microscopic one. There is also the issue of synchronization. The body relies on countless internal clocks, heart rhythms, neural firing patterns, cellular cycles. These clocks are not perfectly precise, but they are coordinated. When space-time is manipulated, coordination becomes difficult. Some processes speed up, others lag behind. The harmony that sustains life begins to drift. Even brief exposure could be dangerous. Unlike mechanical components, biological tissues do not simply snap and stop. They degrade. They lose function gradually, sometimes invisibly. Damage may not be immediately obvious, but it accumulates. By the time symptoms appear, repair may no longer be possible. This is not speculation meant to frighten. It is a reflection of how tightly life is tuned to its environment. The body is resilient within familiar boundaries and surprisingly vulnerable outside them. Extreme heat, extreme cold, extreme pressure, all reveal how narrow the margin truly is. Space-time distortion represents an extreme of a different kind, one that affects every level of structure simultaneously. Protection might seem possible in theory. Shielding, damping fields, isolation layers. But protection itself introduces new problems. Barriers must interact with space-time to function. Anything that blocks distortion also experiences it. The forces cannot simply be kept outside. They must be managed everywhere at once. And then there is the question of duration. Even if the journey lasts only an instant by external clocks, the body may not experience it that way. Internal processes could stretch or compress unevenly. Recovery assumes continuity. If continuity is lost, recovery becomes meaningless. This leads to a quiet but profound conclusion. Time travel is not merely a question of arrival. It is a question of survival through the transition. The moment between departure and arrival may be the most dangerous part, precisely because it is not a place or a time where ordinary biology makes sense. There is also a deeper implication. The more precisely you shape space-time to achieve your destination, the less forgiving it becomes. Gentle transitions introduce uncertainty. Sharp transitions introduce force. The requirements of navigation and the needs of the body pull in opposite directions. Optimizing for one undermines the other. This tension cannot be resolved by better engineering alone. It reflects a mismatch between what space-time manipulation demands and what biological life can tolerate. Machines can be redesigned. Materials can be reinforced. Cells cannot. They carry billions of years of evolutionary history that assumes a stable temporal background. As this realization settles, the fantasy of time travel changes tone again. The danger is no longer cosmic or philosophical. It is intimate, quiet, vulnerable. Even perfect technology may deliver a traveler who cannot survive the journey intact. And this vulnerability extends beyond the physical. If the body struggles to endure temporal distortion, what happens to the mind? What happens when perception itself is stretched, reordered, or flooded with experiences the brain was never meant to process? That question leads gently into the final human challenge of time travel, where the greatest strain may not be on cells or tissues, but on meaning itself. The human mind is exquisitely tuned to the present. Memory reaches backward, imagination stretches forward, but experience itself unfolds in a narrow window we call now. This limitation is not a flaw, it is a kind of shelter. It allows meaning to arise gradually, moment by moment, without overwhelming the mind with the full weight of time all at once. Time travel threatens this shelter quietly, not with shock, but with clarity. To know the past as something you can visit is different from remembering it. Memory is softened by distance. It fades, it reshapes itself. It protects us by forgetting details we no longer need. The past we recall is never perfectly sharp. It is filtered through emotion, relevance, and time. But the past you stand inside is not filtered. It is immediate. Events do not arrive as stories. They arrive as sensations, sounds, faces, movements, consequences. The mind is forced to process what it was never meant to process directly. History ceases to be narrative and becomes environment. The future carries a different burden. Anticipation normally exists as possibility. The future might happen this way, or that way, or not at all. This uncertainty is what allows hope, motivation, and surprise to exist. If the future becomes something you've already witnessed, possibility collapses into certainty. Certainty is not always comforting. Knowing what will happen strips decisions of their emotional texture. Choice becomes performance. Effort feels theatrical. Success and failure lose their tension because their outcomes are already known. Even joy risks becoming thin when its ending's visible from the beginning. The mind relies on uncertainty the way muscles rely on resistance. Without it, psychological strength weakens, curiosity fades, attention drifts. The present moment, once rich with potential, begins to feel like a corridor you're simply walking through on the way to something already decided. There is also the problem of contradiction between experience and knowledge. Imagine living through a moment while knowing precisely how it will end. The brain must hold two realities at once. the unfolding present, and the fixed future. So this split attention creates strain. Emotions arise that the mind immediately invalidates. Fear feels pointless. Hope feels naive. Grief arrives early and lingers too long. Over time, this dissonance may erode presence itself. The mind learns to detach, to observe rather than participate. Life becomes something watched rather than lived. The self recedes behind a layer of foreknowledge that cannot be set aside. Even witnessing the past carries its own quiet dangers. Seeing moments that shaped history, moments people believed were private or transient, introduces an ethical weight that does not announce itself loudly. The traveller becomes a carrier of knowledge that cannot be shared without consequence and cannot be forgotten without effort. Silence becomes heavy. Speech becomes risky. This isolation is subtle. It does not feel like loneliness in the ordinary sense. Others are present. Conversation continues, but shared reality thins. When no one else knows what you know, when no one else carries the same temporal context, connection becomes asymmetrical. You listen more than you speak. You explain less than you understand. There is also the erosion of scale. When the mind holds centuries at once, individual moments shrink. Daily concerns feel trivial. Personal struggles feel temporary in a way that undermines their importance. This perspective might sound enlightened, but it comes at a cost. Meaning depends on proportion. When everything is seen from far away, nothing feels close. The brain evolved to care intensely about short horizons. A day, a season, a lifetime. Stretch that horizon too far and emotional signals weaken. Motivation fades not because life is unimportant, but because importance dissolves when everything is equally small against an immense temporal backdrop. This is why knowledge itself can become a burden, not because it is wrong, but because it is too complete. The mind thrives on partial views, on stories told in sequence. Time travel replaces sequence with simultaneity. The narrative structure of life collapses into a flat landscape where beginnings and endings coexist. In such a landscape, rest becomes difficult. Sleep relies on letting go of unfinished thoughts. But how do you let go of a future you've already seen? How do you release a past you have physically occupied? The mind circles, it reviews, it replays. Closure becomes elusive. This is not madness, it is adaptation. The mind trying to reorganize itself around a reality it was never designed to inhabit. Some might endure longer than others, some might find ways to compartmentalize, but no one would emerge unchanged. And perhaps that is the quietest limit of all. Even if the universe allowed time travel, even if machines could endure, even if bodies could survive, the mind might slowly lose its footing, not in panic, but in meaning. As this understanding settles, the question of whether time travel is possible begins to feel less important than whether it is livable. Whether a life stretched across visible past and future can still feel like a life at all. This realization does not arrive as fear. It arrives as softness, a gentle awareness that ignorance is not merely absence of knowledge, but a kind of protection. That uncertainty is not a flaw to be eliminated, but a space where meaning can breathe. And with that thought, the journey turns toward its final resting place, away from what might be built and toward why it may be better left untouched. By now, the question of whether a time machine can be built feels almost beside the point, not because it has been answered decisively, but because it has been transformed. What began as a challenge of engineering has unfolded into a meditation on limits, not as barriers imposed from outside, but as boundaries that arise naturally from the structure of reality itself. Throughout this journey, each obstacle has appeared less like a wall and more like a soft resistance. Energy demands that stretch beyond practicality. precision requirements that dissolve intuition, instabilities that prevent loops from settling, bodies that strain, minds that quietly lose their footing. None of these say never outright. They simply say not easily, and then not gently, and finally not without cost. This is where ethics enters, not as a list of rules, but as a recognition of consequence. A machine that could move freely through time would not exist in isolation. It would sit within human society, shaped by incentives, fears, ambitions, and misunderstandings. Even if built with care, it would inherit the unpredictability of its makers. The risk is not only that such a machine could be weaponized, though that possibility alone is sobering. The deeper risk is that its consequences would extend far beyond intent. History is shaped not just by deliberate actions, but by misunderstandings, miscalculations, and accidents. Introducing time travel into this mix would amplify those effects beyond anything we could meaningfully control. It is tempting to imagine moral safeguards, algorithms that prevent interference, rules that limit access, systems that distinguish observation from action. But morality encoded into machines must operate in environments that change faster than rules can adapt. What seems harmless in one context may become catastrophic in another. What feels ethical today may be naive tomorrow. More importantly, ethics presumes agency, choice, deliberation. But many of the limits we've encountered do not wait for choice. They act before intention can matter. Instability does not ask what you plan to do with a time loop. It dissolves the loop before the question arises. Biology does not negotiate with ambition. It responds to force as it always has. This suggests a quieter conclusion. The universe may not need us to decide whether time travel should exist. It may already have decided not through prohibition, but through structure. By making the cost too high, the margin too thin, the consequences too diffuse, reality gently discourages certain possibilities without forbidding curiosity itself. There is something deeply humane about this kind of limit. It does not punish imagination. It allows exploration up to the point where exploration would cease to be livable. It lets us ask the question, build the models, chase the ideas, and then gently reminds us where our nature fits. Seen this way, not building a time machine is not a failure of intelligence, it is a success of balance. Civilization has advanced by learning not only what it can do, but what it should approach with care. Fire warms and destroys, energy powers and destabilizes, knowledge illuminates and burdens. Time travel, if it exists at all, may belong to this same category, except its risks scale too quickly for wisdom to keep pace. There is also a quiet gift in the forward flow of time. Uncertainty gives life texture. Forgetting gives memory shape. Not knowing what comes next allows presence to matter. The fragility of moments is what makes them precious. If every moment could be revisited, repeated, or revised, meaning itself would thin. Experience would flatten into availability. The patience of time is easy to overlook. It does not rush. It does not argue. It continues, indifferent to our plans, generous in its consistency. We wake, we live, we sleep. Causes follow effects. Stories unfold once, and then become memory. This simplicity is not primitive. It is robust. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing is not that time travel may be impossible, but that time works at all. That a universe so vast, so dynamic, so intricate, allows continuity to emerge. That moments follow one another in a way minds can inhabit. That meaning survives change. So the journey settles here, not in disappointment, but in quiet appreciation. For the present moment, narrow and fleeting. For the past, softened by memory. For the future, open enough to invite hope. Time flows on, untouched, patient, indifferent. And in that indifference, it offers us something stable enough to live inside.